In case it hasn't become clear by this point in the class, I'm kind of a nerd. Space, science fiction, most fantasy that doesn't involve fairies and romance. I'm all on board. So when I heard there was a concept about force fields, I was all in. I am very excited to record this video for you and talk about force field analysis. It actually is one of my favorite theories, and ties really neatly into the rule element of the IRAC argument structure. So in the previous video, we talked about the issue, and the goal there was to prove that the issue was real and that the audience should care about it. Great. But that's usually not the problem that causes conflict and causes discussions to go awry. What makes the right solution is often a cause for conflict and controversy. One way to help solve that is to have a clear rule. So let's start with this. I am having a conundrum and need help making a clear decision for my future. Should I get a dog? This lovely animal to the left side of me, right to the viewer, is Jackson. He doesn't know it, but he actually belongs to my parents. He lives in Arizona, but I visit him regularly. So, should I get a dog for myself? Let's walk through this question, right? So, reasons I should get a dog. Companionship, as you can see in that previous photo, Jackson and I are really tight. I've liked dogs my whole life. I've had dogs since I was young, but not in my adult life have I had my own dog that lived with me. So I would have companionship. I would also have benefited mental health, is a common argument, right? Having a dog calms you down. You can pet the animal, right? Your emotional support that these animals bring. That's a really positive thing. Also, exercise, right? I'd have to take the dog for walks. I'd have to take it outside to go to the bathroom. I'd get more active exercise than I would just my normal day and or going to the gym. And finally, unconditional affection. In our society, there's a lot of things that are conditional, but for dogs in particular, not cats, but for dogs, their affection is unconditional. You don't have to earn it. As long as you aren't abusive and are very good to the animal, they will love you for being you. And that's a really positive, rewarding thing for an individual. Reasons maybe not to. I have an irregular schedule with speech and debate tournaments, with sometimes I'm on campus for like 3 hours a day, but other times I'm on campus for 12 to 14 hours a day. It's an irregular schedule. The dog wouldn't be eating on a regular schedule. It might not be able to go to the bathroom because I'd be stuck on campus. For a long time, I lived far away from campus, so that's a long trip. So that's a reason no. I travel a lot, whether it's speech and debate or personal travel. There's a lot of like I'll be gone for a week or I'll be gone for a weekend or something like that. And that's not for the dog. I might have to put it in a board, like a shelter, not a shelter, a boarding place. I might have to find someone to watch the dog. There's a lot of elements that go along with that. There's also financial obligations, vaccines, health care, right? Taking it to the vet regularly. Um, Obviously, I have to buy supplies, dog food. There's some financial obligations. That's a negative. There's also a time commitment, right? I have exercise and walks, but that means I have to go on those walks. I have to be home to go on those walks. Um, there's a lot of time and care that goes into having an animal. A lot of people say it's worth it, but it is something to consider on the negative side. So this basically becomes a pro con sheet. But what you do is you put point values to them. How important is companionship? How important is it that I maintain this irregular schedule, right? Because maybe it would be less convenient for my job, but I could put a more strict schedule in place to assure that I can be home for the animal, right? I can make the time, I can spend the money. It's just a matter of, at the end of the day, if the point value's on the no side, outweigh the point values on the yes side, then the answer is no. And if the point values on the yes side are more than the values on the no side, then the answer is yes, right? This is a simplified version of a force field analysis where you try to quantify some things that are typically not quantifiable. And sometimes certain things are like way more important than other ones. This guy, for example, not approving getting a dog. This is Mr. Wednesday. He's actually my girlfriend's cat, but we live together, so there you go. Um, so no dog for me as long as he's in the picture. And as much as I have joked about it, it has been made very clear he must stay in the picture. I can't like, you know, accidentally lose him. But he's a cool guy. So that's an example of how like you look at that and you're like, this is the most important thing. And therefore the answer is no, regardless of all of the other points and arguments on the other side. So when we think about this from a force field analysis argument side, what does it teach us? It teaches us that individual human decision making is not as simple as a vote, right? There are different points, right, that have different weight, and you have to know your audience and what is the most valuable to them. We also consider emotion, logic, and credibility. These all go together, and they're all sort of in this big old mush. Sometimes our emotion, say a connection to a particular cat, outweighs logic. The cat's great. I love the cat. And now that's recorded on video that I said that word. Um, you also might have credibility. I trust this source more than I trust that source. So this source has more weight, right? So we sort of merge all of these together and we come out with a total that theoretically tells us which direction to go. Not all arguments hold the same weight for the same people. And then understanding how we think and process these variables helps us as advocates and people making an argument convince an audience to think, do, right? It motivates them to engage in a way that we want them to engage. So when we talk about this in terms of force fields, what is that actually referencing? Each of these objects, points, contentions, considerations, drives us one way or the other. And then in theory, at the end of the day, the side with the greater force, that's the side we land on. That's like the psychological theory behind it. Speaking of psychological theories, we're going to talk about force field analysis theory, and then we're going to talk about how it applies to the debate concept of rule, or argument concept of rule. Right? Ha ha ha, Star Wars joke. Done. Carl Lewin was a psychologist and sociologist. And as you can see, he was of an olden time because black and white photos. So his this theory starts with him, right? That humans are consistently pulled between a variety of forces. Certain things that motivate them to act, to not act, to make a decision, to not make a decision, to make one decision or an opposing decision, right? And our emotion, our desire, our morality, and values are all forces that have to be considered. In the example of getting a dog, we looked at a specific decision and looked at specific variables that might play into that decision. But on a larger scale, right, you might look at a type of variable, emotional reaction, and say, how does that factor in to driving someone towards this decision? Logic, how does that factor into driving someone to this decision? Credibility, I just named all of our three general appeals, right? Our emotion, credibility of different sources, our emotion and logic all play into this and decide what we do. But there's also personal preference, right? When you talk about desire and also values. So your attitudes, values, and beliefs motivate you. If something's going to violate your belief system and your values, then at the end of the day, that's probably going to weigh pretty heavily on your decision making process, right? Various political topics, people are asked, why do you believe this? And they often lean on, well, I'm a Christian, or I'm an atheist, or I'm Muslim, and these are the values that I have that drive me to believe this thing or have this opinion, right? Hang on, we're getting glitchy. There we go. So, this is a decision-making tool, right? A lot of companies or organizations might employ a force field analysis as like, again, it's kind of a glorified pro-con chart in order to assess decision making. What are the things that are most important to us as an organization or individuals or a couple or whatever? And how do we assess the value of it, right? Deciding on an apartment. You and your roommate might say, these are the things that are really important. These are the must haves. These are the nice to haves. And these are the things that we don't really need. And then you sort of create your list of like this location, this apartment has these things that we like, and this apartment has these things that we like and really want. And you kind of assess, neither's perfect, probably. And so, which one, what are the most important things, and how do you assess that? Um, it also helps us sometimes predict outcomes. So, as a persuader, we might use this as a tool to be like, hey, what are some outcomes that might occur? What are some reactions that might happen? What are some reasons someone might not be persuaded by this message? And how can we adjust our messaging in order to account for that? The goal is to decide what is best, often. We also use this for individual decision making. Again, attitudes, values, beliefs. Why do we vote the way we do? Well, we compare the proposal, say it's a ballot initiative, with our values, with our attitudes, and with our beliefs in order to decide, does it align with us? Does this represent us well? And does this fulfill the tenets of our value system? Right? So if you think of, we're going to get into rule in a minute, but if you think of your value set as a rule, these are the criteria of a good decision. This is a moral decision. And then you compare the action, say the ballot initiative or proposal, when we get into our later assignments, to the value set. How do these compare? Do they align? And if the answer is yes, then you vote for it. If the answer is no, then you have these forces pushing back against your vote, leading you to no. Um, and so that's really interesting. When I was preparing to vote in the 2024 election, right? Trump's second election, well, third election cycle, but second elected year, and various other things. There was an abortion legalization ballot initiative. And I heard a woman talking about it with some people and was like, "Yeah, I read it and I don't like it because it takes the parents out of the picture." Whatever your beliefs on that topic, whatever your beliefs on that particular presumption, right? I like this example to think about how people have different priorities and value sets. She firmly believes in parental rights. That is a core value of her identity. And so, regardless of anything else, before she even got into the nitty gritty of the bill and what it did and didn't do, she said, it leaves parents out of it. I'm voting against it. Her belief drove her decision because parental rights to her are the most important, which fair if that is your value set and you're going to live up to it. That's why we have votes and elections. This gives people opportunity to express those things. And then we can kind of say, this is generally what people think. And then that decision is what's made. You also see personal preference. We've talked about the hierarchy of needs last video. Our desires and cultural influences all drive us towards certain decision making. These are all forces that lead us to decisions. But let's look at the hierarchy of needs. I'm careful with this one because it's often descriptive, not predictive. But it's an interesting framework to use. when assessing prioritization of things, right? Humans want to survive, belong, feel valued, be celebrated, win, right? Think about some of the things you want. What are some of the things that you do? What are some of the sacrifices you make now for your future? I worked my way through college in food service. If you think that built up my esteem, boy, you've never worked in food service. But my physiological needs and safety needs, the ability to pay for rent, pay for food, was more important at that time. That was a priority and a high priority. So yeah, I worked at Burger King. I worked at a pizza place. I worked at some jobs where I was not necessarily treated well in order to get to where I wanted to be long term. So we also have kind of that time frame. We're willing to make short-term sacrifices if the long-term benefits there, right? But if psychological or physiological and safety needs are fulfilled, then we're like, let's prioritize love and belonging. Let's prioritize esteem. Let's drive people towards self-actualization so that they can feel their most authentic selves. These are degrees, these are like levels. If you think about it like a point value, the highest point values are at the bottom. We will sacrifice our esteem if it means we get lunch today, potentially. And then we use it for group decisions. We have these dialectical tensions. If you've taken like interpersonal communication or group communication, you've heard of these concepts of dialectics. These are two opposing concepts: openness and closedness. You want to be open and transparent if you're a leader, but you also need to have your own personal space. There are things that your subordinates don't need to know because they haven't been decided on yet, or perhaps they don't need to know how something was decided. So leaders often have to decide, how open and closed am I going to be? How much am I going to share about my personal life? How much am I going to keep to myself? You also have, kind of looking at the right hand column, autonomy and connection. That's actually on both sides. A lot of couples run into this where it's like, I want to be autonomous. I want to be my own self. I'm me, not just an attachment of this other person. But you also want to maintain a connection to that person, whether that's a romantic partner that you want to keep that romantic bond in, or a connection to a group that you're very passionate about and you want to be part of that group, right? We want to be ourselves and we want to be part of the collective. How do those two things interact at the same time? These are different forces, and each individual instant, you get to make a choice about how you play that off, right? How close, how connected. How important is it that I'm connected now versus how much is it important that I'm not connected right now? You also look at control. That's a good one to think about. How much control do I need? When I teach organizational communication, the textbook is usually organizational communication, balancing creativity and constraint, right? Constraint is like control. I want everyone to do this through my system and do it the exact same way. But then you limit creativity. You're not going to have as much innovation if you aren't letting people experiment and test and have different ideas. And so you balance it. You put in place the guardrails you need, but allow a certain amount of flexibility. But you have to decide how much that is. Different contexts call for different needs, right? So if I'm in a context where it's like life and death, I don't want a fireman being creative during a fire. I want them to follow procedure, follow the rules, and do it right and save my ass. But save my butt. Because that's their job. And when they're innovative and things don't work, people die, right? So there's context, right? And that's another part of this, force field analysis. The life and death element drives away creativity and pushes us towards consistency, control, and repetition, right? So you can start to see how all of this sort of comes together in terms of decision making, different contexts of different influences. And then the TRIP model is a conflict goal. um, model that just talks about how we have different goals in conflicts, whether it's the topic slash task, whether it's building a relationship, establishing our identity, or following a certain process. We prioritize different goals to different degrees. And when we do it differently than someone else, that's when conflict arises. So if I'm prioritizing the relationship over getting the A on the assignment, someone who's like, I have to get an A, screw all these group members. I want an A. Obviously, there's going to be conflict there. Some other context to consider. I mentioned some corporate stuff, academic contexts. How do we decide what majors to offer? How do we decide how to set up a major? What classes are mandatory? What major should you do? Right? Like that's also an academic context. Social contexts. How do we decide even a simple decision like where do we go for lunch after class or dinner after class? Right? Is there a process? Is there a vote? Um, are there certain things that are off limits? If someone is allergic to peanuts, you can't go to Chick-fil-A because Chick-fil-A uses peanut oil. At least they used to. And so that weighs very heavily to influence people not to go to Chick-fil-A if someone in their group would theoretically die from eating it. And then, of course, familial. We talk about autonomy and connection. How connected and independent do you want to be from your family? And that's a huge conflict point when people like go home from college after a year or two away and they're like, I'm my own self. And the power structure is like, no, you're still part of this system. And there's this tug of war over your identity between you and I'm just calling it the power structure, parental power structure, in order to try to figure, and there needs to be a new balance made, right? So again, forces clashing until certain in order to make decisions and find balance. So now our force fields are activated, right? Just think of it as there's influences pushing one way, there's influences pushing the other, and your job as a persuasion change maker is to highlight certain things on one side to drive the decision over here, right? How do you add points to a particular side? Good way to do that is to think about it in the concept of a rule. Issue. That's the problem. What's happening right now, right? There's a Wawa in University and it's being renovated. So I can't stop there for my Wawa sandwich in the morning because it's not open. That's a serious problem. What's the rule? Clearly, the value here is that I want my sandwich. But the Wawa has a slightly different rule set. They're trying to maximize profits and maybe create consistency, maybe they just needed to renovate it and it wasn't safe, right? So we're gonna kind of use that. Have a Wawa coffee. Yes, I sometimes improv my examples even on recorded videos. Um, to frame this next thing, right? So a rule from an IRAC perspective is a common measure. It is a common point at which we can say something is or is not true or is not good, right? Remember I talked about value sets and decision making. We apply a proposal or a ballot initiative to our value set and assess whether or not it matches. When you're talking about this from a legal standpoint, that value set is replaced by the law, right? In a specific framed out moral code that says when something is murder, when something is theft, when something is manslaughter, whatever it might be, right? At what point does it become that thing? And we're just asking, does this and this align? So it eliminates variables and whataboutisms. Having a clear rule prevents people from going over here and talking about all these red herrings because all we're talking about is whether or not this rule is being upheld. It also establishes a decision making criteria, a value, or some sort of ethical framework. So, what are some of these values? Why should we prioritize, or what should we prioritize first, right? Here's kind of a running list of common argumentation and values used in like debate, for example. Education. We should prioritize education. Education is really important. But you don't just say the value, right? Because I might define education differently than you value or define education. So you have to define it, explain it, and then justify why it's important. What are the effects that good education has? So when we start talking about value assessments and value summaries, you're not just saying this is education and this is why education is good. You're really making an argument that education is the highest priority. Quality of life, the highest priority, right? That's how well do we live. Because what might happen is someone else might have a different value. So you bring in education and I talk about quality of life. And I say quality of life should come in first because you can't get educated if you can't afford food. If you're at school hungry, you're not learning. So it doesn't matter how good the education system is, how much resources we put into education. Quality of life must predate education in order for education to matter. So that's an argument for why quality of life ought to be prioritized over education. Health. Similar could make a similar argument, right? You can't learn if you're not in the hospital. Environmentalism, right? We could talk about the magnitude of potential of global warming, right? And what potentially could happen if no environmental actions are taken, right? Fairness. What is fair? Why is fair? Why does fair matter? Liberty, the ability to kind of choose our own path. And when should that be prioritized over other things? That's the Second Amendment debate. Should we have the right to bear arms because that is a right that we have? Or should there be some limits on it because of safety? That's a value clash. Safety versus liberty are at odds in that argument. And at the moment, no, it's sort of this tug of war back and forth, and no one can really come up no one can really agree. And then freedom of religion, freedom of speech, also hotly debated in our current era. So those are values. Now you might look at this through a different criteria. So I'm going to look at net benefit to education. So what benefits education the most? Which adds to education the most? And that's really important. It's talking about adding to education. Where a cost benefit analysis compares the costs and the benefits. So it's not just what adds, but you also have to take into account what subtracts from education the most. Well, I mean, if it subtracts, you would then vote no, in theory, right? A lot of times, this is what we default to. And if you're not sure, I would just use cost benefit analysis. I think it's a really clear, I'll sometimes use the word decision criteria when assessing some sort of future proposed change. What are the costs? What are the benefits? What does and who wins? That's literally a force field analysis. These are the costs, these are the benefits, what side comes out on top. And then on balance is just sort of some generic the analogy is like you have a scale, it's more of a true false question, right? And whichever weighs more, that is the side that is true. You can also use philosophical frameworks. Utilitarianism, actions are just dependent on the consequences, also sometimes referenced as consequentialism. We look at the consequences of our actions and our decisions and a proposed change, right? Because remember, debates like this kind of hypothetical future policy making simulation, right? And so we might make a decision based off that, like utilitarianism. We should do the thing that is best for the most people, right? That is quite often utilized to make decisions in our world. We also look at Kant, universalization. If it is moral for one, it must be moral for all. So if it's not moral for everybody to do this, then it's immoral, and we should not do it either. And then Hobbes talks about the social contract, which is kind of this role of government idea. If you're talking about government theory, that's a good one to look into as well, right? That here is this role of government. These are the responsibilities of a governing body. And then you ask, does this uphold those rules? So, decision making is tricky, but kind of understanding the motivations of somebody, right? Looking through a force field analysis lens helps us decide what to focus on. What weighing mechanism, value criterion, and or rule is going to be the most persuasive that is the one that we should use. Establishing a clear rule helps us narrow the playing field. Um, and so this is a good time to start thinking about partners. We're going to start building some arguments in the next few weeks. You're going to want to have partners for some of these debates that we got going on. Um, so, kind of taking this all back and looking at it at one at the end. You've established that there is an issue, that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. We're going to talk about developing a plan text or proposal later, but now we are at rule. When you take the rule and the issue together, you want those to be really thorough and explained. You don't want to get into solutions and proposals. You just want to focus on those first. That's a lot of the heavy lifting because when we get into analysis, that's more just tying everything together with a neat little bow because you've done the work to establish that there's a problem and establish the rule. And when we get into analysis, we're really going to talk about kind of a quick summary of the issue, a link to the plan, application to the plan, and what we're going to call solvency, and then how that upholds the value. It's really a four-step analysis process. But we have to have that framework. If you're trying to re-explain the framework in the later part, people are going to get lost. So you have to establish it early and get buy-in, or people aren't going to really follow or buy your analysis later. So hopefully these two videos have helped, and I will see you at the next one.